I'm Larry Van Meter. I'm the head at Morristown Friends School in Morristown, New Jersey. The wartime experiences of Warren Sawyer and Neil Hartman remind us that heroism takes many forms. As conscientious objectors, their experience was different from that of the soldiers serving on the front lines during World War II. But what they did required great courage and fortitude. I've known Warren and Neil all my life. As a child growing up, I knew them as quiet leaders in our local friends meeting here in Morristown, New Jersey. Later, I got to know Neil as a teacher and Warren as a family friend. The Religious Society of Friends, which is the more formal name for Quakerism, is a Christian denomination that believes deeply in equality and nonviolence. Quakers typically are pacifists, and the selective service system that guided millions of young men through the draft process during World War II had provisions for those with religious objections to serving in the armed forces. Instead, they were required to perform alternative service in a non-combatant setting. But the service they provided was anything but easy. Warren tells of the difficult work he did at the Byberry State Hospital in Pennsylvania, and Neil tells of volunteering to be injected with a terrible disease in an effort to enhance medical science. Their stories are important, but are also little known. An important chapter in our nation's history that illustrates that in a pluralistic society, at least within limits, the nation can make room for people with religious convictions that differ from official government policy.
We are interviewing two conscientious objectors from the Second World War, Warren Sawyer and Neil Hartman. Both Warren and Neil were born in 1920. Neil Hartman, who was a conscientious objector during the Second World War. Can you tell us something about your early life in Ohio?
My father owned a men's clothing store. He and my mother got married in Cincinnati, but they moved to Cedarville because there was a college there, and they wanted to have a place where their children could go to college. The town had about 1,000 people, and the college had about 200 students.
At that time, what church did you go to?
Methodist Church.
Methodist Church. And how did you become a Quaker?
In 1939, my sister went to a Quaker work camp in Philadelphia, and I'm sorry I never really asked her how she found out about it or how she did, but she persuaded me in 1940, the next year, to sign up for a Quaker work camp in Michigan, which I did. That was the first time I really had anything to do with Quakers. You didn't have to sign up for the draft until you were 21. I was only 20, but I knew it was coming, so it was very, very lucky that we had all that time to talk about what Christians should do.
Warren, can you tell me something about your early life? You're growing up in, say, I believe, New York City?
My early life is kind of a bad story. I was born in Philadelphia. My parents were divorced when I was 25. In 1925, we went to New York City, and in 1933, I left my mother to go to live on the farm in upstate New York near Ithaca, where my real aunt lived. Well, it was a very upsetting time. This uncle died on Easter in 1933, and it was just upsetting and moving all the time in the Depression. One place we stayed only one night because we couldn't afford the rent. And we moved in many places in New York City on Manhattan Island only. And as a young man, I guess it upset me. I'm looking back now. I guess it upset me in many different ways, and it certainly affected my study habits. When my real life began, as far as I am concerned, to grow up, to learn, to know how to be with people, and that's about the roughest part of my life. But the farm things leveled out very well because I was really a rebel at a young age.
Neil, so you went to register as a conscientious objector. What happened?
First of all, the next year in '41, I went to Mexico with the American Friends Service Committee. Obviously, we spent most of our time discussing what men should do with the peacetime draft.
So you applied for to be a conscientious objector.
I knew in 1941 in Mexico that when I came back to the United States, I turned 21 in Mexico, so I had to sign up within 5 days of coming back to the United States. It's interesting, we think of America as a peace country. Our Mexican friends urged us to stay there because then we wouldn't have to sign up. But I came back and I'd been hired at the Marysville High School, so I had to sign up I signed up as CO.
When you registered, were you accepted as a conscientious objector?
No, I was in Greene County, Ohio, which had Antioch College, and I blame them for most of my trouble. Antioch had very poor public relations, and the draft board in Greene County said they weren't going to let any of those communists get out of going to war. So I got turned down.
Okay, and did you appeal?
I appealed to the state, and when you appealed to the state, you had to have a hearing with an hearing officer. So I went to Dayton, Ohio, and spent an hour and a half or so, very uncomfortable. He kept asking me what I would do if my grandmother was raped, and I didn't have a grandmother, so I really didn't have to worry about that. So I went over to NSBRO.
That's what?
The NSBRO is the National Service Board for Religious Objectors. And when I talked to them and told them who my hearing officer was in the state of Ohio, they immediately took action. He had a national reputation for being very hard on COs. Right while I was there talking to them, they called up selective service and said we had this boy here who had so-and-so hearing officer. I had appealed to the national board, but it was like the Supreme Court. They didn't have to take your appeal if they didn't want to, and they refused to take my appeal. But after he called them up, they changed their mind. They said they'd take my appeal, and very shortly after that, I got the 4E from the national board.
Okay, so you're drafted, and then what happens?
I had taught 1 year in Marysville, Ohio, and I resigned in August because I knew I was going to be drafted. I didn't think it was fair to start teaching in September when you knew you'd be drafted.
How did you get to Byberry?
I went to Merrill, Indiana in April, and in September we all got a letter asking us if we would volunteer for Byberry. But if I went to Byberry, the state of Pennsylvania would pay for my room and board. I would learn something about mental health that I knew nothing about. And so for all those reasons, I wouldn't have to pay the $30. I'd learn about mental health, and the climate would be better. So I volunteered. After I volunteered for Byberry, I got a letter from Charles Zeller, the superintendent of Byberry, asking if I would be interested in volunteering as a human guinea pig for hepatitis. This was the worst disease of World War II for the American Army. And incidentally, they were actually giving the disease to the soldiers because the yellow fever vaccine they were using for the soldiers was not pure enough, so it contained hepatitis virus. As soon as they found that out, of course they cracked down on where you could get the yellow fever vaccine. You had to go to New York to get it. And also they started this experiment in the University of Pennsylvania with a major of the Army, Dr. Neath, in charge of the experiment to find out how to cure hepatitis.
What did this involve?
I spent 4 days a week working at library as attendant, and 2 days a week I had to go to downtown to the University of Pennsylvania to have them take blood. Of course, they took blood first and found out my levels. Then they inoculated me with dirty blood. Dirty blood was blood that had come from a person who had hepatitis. And then had an incubation period of about 60 days, I think.
What happened as a result of being inoculated with this contaminated blood?
I said we went down there twice a week for these tests. When I went down there once, I said, "Hey, last week you were sick." It was so mild that I didn't know it, but the blood showed up that I'd had hepatitis. We had 2 kinds of hepatitis. We called them serum and infectious. They now call them A and B. We didn't have C then. And what I had was serum hepatitis, came from dirty blood, and it was very, very mild. But after I had a few weeks rest from that, then they asked me to take a drink of dirty water. Dirty water was water contaminated with sewage. And about 60 days after that, I woke up in the middle of the night shaking my bed, and I knew I had hepatitis. And they immediately put me in the infirmary in the University of Pennsylvania.
When this was over, they did other tests. You understand they had a biopsy?
5 of us had both kinds of hepatitis, and they persuaded us to let them take a biopsy of our livers to prove that we'd come back to normal. I wanted the general anesthesia, but they talked me out of general anesthesia because they said there's a slight risk there. And since we were volunteers, they didn't want anything happening to us. When they cut me open, I felt a very, very sharp pain. This is Dr. C. Everett Koop who was doing the surgery. And I thought, "Koop, you lied to me." But when they were taking the blanket off after the operation, they said, "Oh, look, we stuck him with a safety pin." So I really felt better that he hadn't lied to me.
This is Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became the Surgeon General.
That's correct. He was interning at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania Hospital.
Neil, these are tests that could have taken your life. Why did you do this?
Well, of course, we got called all kinds of things, yellow bellies, and they said they could see the streak down their back. So I wanted to show that I was willing to take a risk with my life. I was not willing to take risks with somebody else's life. So I was really thankful that I had this opportunity to show that maybe I wasn't a yellow belly after all.
Your career after the war, what did you do?
I said I taught at public school in Ohio before I was drafted. And it was a good school, but I was very unhappy with my colleagues. They were far from being pacifists. And so after I was released from the draft, I decided rather than leave the profession of teaching, I'd try a Quaker camp. Since I came to Philadelphia, then I found out for the first time that Quakers had schools. And one was George School, which is in Bucks County. So I applied at George School and got accepted. And I was very, very happy there with my colleagues, and they were more my kind of people. In fact, I married one of the secretaries there.
Terrific. And how'd you get here to New Jersey?
I married the secretary at George School and taught there for 2 years. One of the wives of the teacher worked for the American Friends Service Committee, named Lorraine Cleveland, and she asked me if I'd be interested in going to Japan to do relief work, and I thought that's a good place to have a honeymoon. So my wife and I went to Japan for 3 years, running a neighborhood center in Tokyo. And when I came back, George School didn't have a vacancy. So I went to the Friends Council on Education in Philadelphia, and they sent me to Morristown. And I got hired at Morristown and taught there 33 years.
Wow. Well, Neil, the nation is fortunate to have men like you. You had the strength of character to maintain your integrity and your conviction. Patriotism comes in many shades. Neil, you're a great American, and I'm proud to know you. Warren, how did you become a Quaker?
Well, I've been in several denominations. I was a Catholic when I was in New York City at St. Patrick's Cathedral with my 2 brothers. We were acolytes at the High Mass with 3 priests. And when I got to the farm, there was a Quaker church. And I say church because it had a minister, a choir, and all that sort of thing, collection, that Philadelphia Quakers didn't know much about at that time. And so I went there regularly. My aunt wouldn't let me go to the Catholic church. It was 5 miles away. It took me 5 years to make up my mind after extensive reading and studying the Quaker philosophy, going to all the conferences all over New York State with the head of New York yearly meeting. And I began to feel that this is the way to live, to conduct my life. And I joined the Quakers in 1937. That's after being introduced to them 5 years earlier. As far as being a CO, that was the major message to me from Quakerism, because it's diametrically opposed to what the Army has as a philosophy. And so I joined very happily.
The 30s roll away and it comes to 1940 and the draft law comes into effect.
Yeah.
And you had to register for the draft.
Yeah.
What happened then?
Well, I registered for the draft and asked for a 4E classification.
What's a 4E?
4E classification is for CO, and that was in the law for Quakers or anybody that felt they didn't want to go into the Army. And I was drafted in February of 1942 and sent to North Carolina to build, or to help build, a national park and also to fight forest fires.
How did you get to Philadelphia?
In September of 1942, I went to Philadelphia State Hospital. I volunteered to go there. I heard about it in Buck Creek. They were starting the CO group at Philadelphia State Hospital, and so I volunteered. I felt that it was a lot more worthwhile.
Tell us about the hospital, the grounds, where it was, and what it looked like. And
the only, looking back on it, and even there, the only sign of what would one person think of as a hospital was in the infirmary where I started working on the night shift. It was the only place in the hospital that had sheets and pillows and pillowcases, because most of the patients in the infirmary, of course, were bedridden patients. But the rest of the hospital is a compliment to even think of it being as a person would think as a normal hospital. The degradation, the filth, the dirt, the treatment, all of those things were the lowest caliber. Paid attendants were violent in terms of treatment of patients to keep them in line. With 300 patients or more in the disturbed ward and the incontinent ward and the various wards. I had a TB ward also. It was just degradation throughout, and not much hope for any of the patients. They had very few ever saw a doctor, very few. I don't know the percentages, but it must be probably 97–98% never saw a doctor.
How many doctors were on staff? Now this is a mental, a hospital for the mentally ill.
Yes, and in the good times before we came, before the war, there were 83 doctors, and when we were there, we had 3 doctors who you didn't see very often. The shortage was very real. Nurses were few, but the patients who needed some kind of medical care were essentially taken care of by the nurses.
How many attendants were there, and what was the ratio between the attendants and the number of mentally ill patients?
We had 3 attendants, 3 COs during the day shift, whereas before the war they had 12 on the day shift. 300 incontinent patients who did not know how to take care of themselves in terms of their excrement, etc. And those 3 guys had all they could do. All we could do was custodial care. When you have 300 men in a room, incontinent, dirty, and all that sort of thing, and they were the lowest rung of the ladder. Repairs upon repairs of straps, cuffs and straps, when patients were padlocked, foot and by hands, in the bed.
What did the patients do during the day, and where did they stay?
Well, we had what they call a day room, about 75 feet long, about 25 feet high ceilings, no benches, no chairs, because the administration was afraid that patients having a violent attack would pick those benches or chairs up and beat some other patients.
Where did the patients sleep?
Well, they had beds in the dormitories in the basement and on the 2nd floor, and the beds were, well, the hospital was built for 3,000 patients, and we had 6,000, and they were still coming in. The Veterans Administration had their hospital filled, and so veterans were coming to Byberry too. But the dorms were crowded, double-decker beds, so close together to accommodate the overflow that you had to go between the beds sideways. You couldn't walk straight in. You had to go sideways to get in. It gives you an idea of how crowded the conditions were.
Conscientious objectors were subjected to testing, different types of testing. I remember once you mentioned frostbite and some of the other. Can you talk about that? The type of things that you encountered as a conscientious objector?
Yes. Dr. Neef, who was an Army doctor, was interested in jaundice, and he came up to Byberry to talk to and interview men who might be interested in volunteering for experiments, be a human guinea pig, in yellow jaundice. There were a lot of projects that we had opportunities to work in. Frostbite was one of them. That was in Boston. On hookworm, pneumonia, malaria. These were all different units around the country where fellows volunteered to be human guinea pigs in experiments and research. One of the other big, I think, important one was the starvation unit, which was in Minneapolis, researching how fast and the best way to bring back the refugees in Europe to mental health and physical health. And what came out of that, and these other projects, I don't know how successful they were.
There was a conscientious objector at Byberry. His name was Charlie Lord. Can you tell us something about him and his contribution?
Charlie Lord took pictures of patients and the conditions in various buildings in Byberry. It was a notorious hospital, as you can tell. He took all these pictures, and many of them appeared in a Life magazine in a feature article showing conscientious objectors at Byberry and of the patient's condition. And I had a lot of those pictures. I don't remember how I got them, but I gave them to Swarthmore Peace Library with my biography. And they were good pictures. They got good publicity in Life magazine.
I understand Eleanor Roosevelt was involved in this also.
Yes, Eleanor Roosevelt got involved with COs, or I should say COs got involved with Eleanor Roosevelt. Somehow, I don't know what they did, but anyway, they had an audience with Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt went to Selective Service System, General Hershey, I assume.
The war ends, and
thank goodness.
You look back and you see how many people were conscientious objectors, and what were their backgrounds?
Just 4, lacking for 12,000 people in CPS.
What is CPS?
Civilian Public Service. That was the title that we were given when we were drafted, and we went to base camps doing work with nature. In addition to that, there were 3,000 men who went to prison. They would not have anything to do with the military system. And they got 3 years, 5 years, because they wouldn't register, or they wouldn't take a physical examination. They wouldn't report for induction. And so they all ended up in prison.
The war is over, and now you're doing volunteer work for UNRWA, and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration,
Yeah.
Which operated from what, 1943 to 1947. Can you tell us about that and some of the things that you did?
Well, I only did one thing with them. After the war, I went to Poland on a ship taking 800 horses to Danzig. I would like to have taken more, but I couldn't because I had a job for the summer and had to go, was married at that time. But the job in escorting these horses over there was just a matter of taking care of them, feeding them, and so on. And we landed in Danzig, but they had a lot of projects going on with UNRWA, goats and cows, calves, and that sort of thing, to various countries in Europe to try and get the farms started again in order to feed the people. It was a basic need. In port, I worked with the Danish Red Cross. They looked young in terms of college. They might have been some a little older than that. But we had a soup kitchen on the back of a truck, and people with all kinds, kids, everybody, all kinds of utensils, hoping to get some of the soup that was ladled out to them from the back of that truck. Some of them only had cups, some of them had small bowls, or bigger bowls, or even a pail. That's all they had left to carry any liquid.
So you return home, you become a successful in real estate for many years, and as you look back at the time during the war, this was a different time, and the public was not very friendly toward conscientious objectors. Matter of fact, they were unfriendly to people who were 4F, who were physically unfit for service. As you look back on that, what are your thoughts? And as you went through that, what kept you going?
After the war, well, I was always interested in social issues, social concerns. And I took the trip to Poland as a social concern. I also took trips to different places in the world, Tanzania, Indonesia, Arizona, with Global Citizens Network, which was a group started in Minneapolis. The person that started it was a young woman, and you pay for your own transportation, you pay all of your own expenses. But the organization paid for the cement or the blocks for rebuilding if that was going to be a project. The idea was to have the natives work with us on the improvements that they wanted in their community. I went to Tanzania, Africa, and I was there for 3 weeks with the same organization. We were doing a study on transferring a day school to a boarding school.
Getting through the war, putting up with the verbal abuse and the sometimes it might even have been physical problems. Did you encounter that? People saying to you that you're shirking your duty, or to that effect. Did you face any of that?
I personally didn't have a great deal of experience with that. They didn't say I was a coward, but they certainly inferred it in language. This is from my mother and from my father. My 2 aunts that I feel is where I was really raised, the farm, made no comment whatsoever.
Well, Warren, I think your life is a testimonial to service to your fellow man, and your strength of conviction and integrity in following your religious beliefs mark you as a most exceptional man. And it's easy to see why you can be very proud of your lifetime's accomplishments. Thank you. Any other thoughts, any other reminiscence that you have of the era?
We had Dr. Neef, who was a major in the Army, was running our jaundice experiment.
I think that it's interesting that your first reason for going into jaundice was my second reason for going into jaundice. I went with the idea of getting rid of disease that was killing people. And then the second reason, which was your first, show that we're not afraid to give our lives if necessary.
So what happens when you talk to veterans of World War II? What is it that you hear from them?
We have talked to many veterans. We have quite a number of veterans here. I've had some wives of veterans say more than the veterans themselves, that why did we do it? But there's been very few questions, all in the total picture. I really can't recall, except a couple of women here let me know that I was on the wrong side of things. And that's about all that I experienced here. We're friends, neighbors.
You're in a very difficult situation, given the times. 1941 was that environment does not exist today. There's a big difference in public attitude, and for you to stand for your convictions and do what you did took a lot of fortitude. You did not run away from the country. You did not turn your back on the nation. You stood for your religious convictions, and you took a lot of abuse. Yeah. You risked your life to prove your patriotism. It's unfortunate that the nation doesn't understand that, and that's one of the reasons why Nino and I are here, so that the nation does understand there are different ways to serve.